Institute, a world-renowned nonprofit organization conducting research and offering educational programs supporting the evolution of consciousness. He has published technical research on methods for expanding consciousness and assisted hundreds of individuals in experiencing and exploring altered states of consciousness. Before beginning his research at the Monroe Institute, Skip, a retired military intelligence officer, was the operations and training officer for the U.S. government's remote viewing program for 10 years. He works closely with scientific efforts of SRI International and the CRV training program developed by Ingo Swann. Responding to national defense intelligence collection requirements, he planned, conducted, and reported remote viewing intelligence collection missions. For nearly 3 decades, Skip has been a college instructor, scientific investigator, and human behavioral engineer, specializing in the design and application of techniques for cultivating favorable states of consciousness. Early in the 1970s, he received an associate degree from the University of New York, earned a baccalaureate degree from the University of Nebraska, and completed his graduate coursework in counseling psychology at the University of Northern Colorado. So please join me in welcoming Skip Atwater.
I think we can go ahead and turn the slide projector on. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I want to start out by inviting this talk to be not exclusively a one-way talk. And if anybody has any questions or clarification, or you didn't understand something I was talking about, apparatus here so that everybody can get an opportunity to share in that. I do want this to be an exchange of information between you and I. I have a unique perspective of something to show you, but the phenomena of ufology is a different subject that I don't usually get involved in, so there may be aspects of a time for open questions at the end. I have a little clock here and a schedule I'm supposed to watch, and there is a speaker following me, but it all ought to work out like everything works out in life. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about. First of all, you know, when I kind of a thing. So we're in part 1 right now. I'm telling you what I'm going to tell you. So, we're going to cover the topics of defining the concept of remote viewing, because this whole talk is about remote viewing and the possibility of underground UFO bases here on our planet. So we need to say I'm going to show you some examples of what that's all about. And then we're going to go into the U.S. government involvement in remote viewing. And then we're going to find out who the players were in that. I was one of the players. We'll go on to talk about the legacy of someone called Pat Price and the fact that he thought there were UFO bases on the planet, and some doubt under my house. You want to have some level-headed judgment about, is this guy crackers, or does he have some reason to believe him as he told you things that are true in the past? Efforts that I made to corroborate the Pat Price UFO data, and then a period of questions. With questions as well. Does anybody want to know what we're going to talk about today? Okay, remote viewing is, I'm going to free myself from the podium here. Maybe I better take this with me. Remote viewing is defined as this process here, a mental ability to be able to perceive things that are isolated from you, from your normal sense. It seems to be a mental activity that people can do, a way of perceiving something with your mental powers alone. Now, I talk about remote viewing in this formalized description, which was formalized by Stanford Research Institute during their New York ASPR, and introduced it to the people at Stanford Research Institute, and they kind of bought into it. This is a really good description of what's going on. What they were trying to do is get away from some definition of clairvoyance or crystal ball gazing, something like that, and to get into some sort of meaningful definition that might be neutral and accepted as some sort of a description. And I talk about remote viewing as being a very structured, has scientific protocols developed over a number of years. When you call 1-800-PSYCHIC-FRIENDS and ask for a reading, that would not qualify as a remote viewing by my definition, because it isn't within this, kind of structure that we learn to do. So let's I'll remind you of that as we were you having French fries for lunch when you did it or whatever? Again, the idea is when I say remote viewing, it means it's a very structured, controlled, protocol-driven type of perception, not just somebody's spurious guesses at whether the stock market's going up or down or not. Not to say that that's invalid, but the term remote viewing was expressly contrived to describe this protocol. This process then involves what you see pointed out here. First of all, we're going to isolate the remote viewer from finding out about this data in any other way. If you're going to ask him, describe where Mr. Jones is right now, you're not going to say, let's see, Mr. Jones has gone to lunch, describe where Mr. Jones is now, because you're going to think of all the restaurants where he might have gone to lunch, right? So you're going to isolate the remote viewer, deny him the ability to, am I too close to a speaker? I'm in a hole or something, okay. Deny the remote viewer the ability to know any objective data about the target. Okay, so you isolate him in some way, either by time isolation or by taking him into a room that has no windows where he can't look out the window and see Mr. him with some sort of a prompt, like the words, describe where Mr. Jones is right now, or describe the location in the sealed envelope, or describe the area demarked as 47 degrees north, 27 degrees west. Provide him some sort of a cue or some sort of a trigger. You push his button and say, do it now. The next part of the process is that the remote viewer objectifies in some way his perceptions. To objectify means, and this is Ingo Swann's definition, to convert from the mental space into objective space by saying and writing. So you want the viewer to objectify his mental perceptions by saying them or writing them or drawing them, to take out of mental space into physical space. After the viewer does this, then the tasker can ask see you drew that big building over there. What was behind the big building kind of thing? So after the viewer objectifies the perceptions, then you kind of ask questions about the perceptions. And you never suggest information to the viewer that he didn't tell you about. You know, you didn't say, next to the big red trash can, what was there? I mean, if he didn't tell you there was a big red trash can, then you don't suggest that there was one there. And then after your questioning and answering and the declarations of the remote viewer, you have a summary prepared, and usually that is, you know, tape recorded and or written out in a narrative of what the summary is. And in a training situation, you provide some sort of feedback providing this person with a learning situation. If you were doing what we call local targeting, like was done at SRI originally, where someone would drive out to a mysterious location and the viewer's job was to describe where he went, then you would actually take the remote viewer to that location afterwards and compare his drawings and his descriptions with that area, so that the remote viewer might learn from actually physically being at the place accuracies and inaccuracies of his perception. Now, in a real-world situation where you're using remote viewing for intelligence purposes or to help the police find where the drug dealer is hiding his stash or a missing child is, sometimes you can't provide feedback. I mean, you just can't say, oh, you were really correct. There's the body right there. I mean, what you're looking for is information that this person can provide. So the idea of using this as an operational information gathering tool is different than training, where you would use a feedback kind of situation. So having set the stage as to what remote viewing is, let's look for a moment at some examples of remote viewing. And I'm showing you these examples so that you might learn what kinds of things can be reported through remote viewing, what kinds of inaccuracies are involved in remote viewing. And we need to have a balanced judgment about this, because as we progress, we're going to talk about UFO stuff. And so we want to understand the remote viewing process and how accurate it may be or may not be if we're going to use it to judge its efficacy against targets that involve UFOs or UFO bases in this case. Now, this exercise was set up as a sealed envelope exercise. The remote viewer is cloistered in a room, and a random number generator generates a specified number, and then you pull an envelope out of the file cabinet marked with that number, leaving the envelope sealed. You lay it on the table in front of the remote viewer and say, describe the location in the picture in the envelope. Describe this location. And the remote viewer then objectifies the descriptions, tells you about it, you get to ask some questions, and then provides a summary. Now in this case, this is the drawing that the remote viewer did of this sealed envelope exercise. So you look at that and you see a nice drawing, and you see some notations that have been made. I've printed with the computer the words up there that parallel the writing. So the printed words are actually what it says in the original handwriting of the remote viewer. And you look at it and you see, well, maybe it's some sort of a tower, and you think, well, maybe it's a rocket launcher, but he says it's definitely not a gantry. Maybe it's some sort of crane or something. So you look at the basic elements of it and say, well, there's something with crisscross beams and guy wires that hold it up and so forth and so on. Doesn't know exactly what it is, and of course, you can't expect from a remote viewer, if you're saying to you, he's at the corner of 5th and Main having a ham sandwich. Remote viewing does not work that way. The remote viewer might come back and say, I hear traffic noise, I smell city, there's lots of high structures around me, and it's a very noisy place. kinds of descriptions a remote viewer can give you. So let's take a look then at what this actual place was. It was, in fact, a oil drilling platform with trailers below it. We'll back up a minute and look at the drawing again. So it is there's a certain amount of accuracy there, but he did not come out in words and say, this is an oil drilling platform on the plains in Oklahoma, 13 miles south. Of information remote viewing provides. Now, as another example here, let's imagine that we're going to use remote viewing to help the police find out where the meeting between the South American drug lord and his distributor is going to be. We have used other police intelligence systems like paid informants and telephone intercepts to find out that there is actually going to be an important meeting, and for the first time we might be able to photograph this drug supplier from South America, and we just need to know where this meeting's going to be. That might be a problem that we could use a remote viewer to tell us where's this meeting going to be. Give him a date and a picture of this person and say, describe his location on this date. And so if the remote viewer came back with a drawing that looked like this, does this tell you where this meeting's going to take place so that we might capture this picture for our police files of this drug supplier? Well, standing alone, it does not. It doesn't come out and say, he's going to be at the corner of 5th and Main and so forth and so on. But if through other information systems we knew that the guy was going to be, say on a telephone intercept, we picked up, well, I'm going to my niece's wedding. After the wedding, I'll meet you at 2 o'clock at the location. Well, you'd use your police sources and find out where does the niece live, where's she getting married, da da da. And if I was to tell you this is in Seattle, Washington, would that help? Can you look at this and know where this guy might be in Seattle, Washington? Does anybody have an idea? Pardon? She says an aquarium.
Space Needle.
Space Needle.
Kingdom.
The Kingdom. Yeah, okay. Let's read some of these things. Does it say anything about being up in the air and rotating? But it is round. The Kingdom certainly has a dome-type shape like that. Okay, it turns out it is, in fact, the aquarium. Okay? Let's go back and see what this remote viewer, Joe McMonagle, one of the best remote viewers in the world, said about this. He said it confines plants, bird-like creatures. Well, these bird-like creatures are the fish swimming around in the water, you know. Bird-like creatures. It's a glass dome, greenhouse, very wet, humid, confined, heavy, huge, overbearing. But he did not use the word aquarium. Okay? Now, again, I have taken the trouble to show you these examples. These are very good remote viewings. In the way you judge scientifically the quality of a remote viewing, these would score really high. These are really good remote viewings. But we have to be careful about how much information is there and how much value we can get from it. Okay. Now, there was a nice thing read about who I was and so forth, and I didn't know that would be read, so I came with this part of the talk. This is my Monroe Institute hat here. So right now, what I do is I'm the Director of Research for the Monroe Institute, and I've been doing that for 10 or 11 years. However, I have what I call a past life experience. And for that, I put on this other hat here. It says the X-Files on it. This one's all. In my past life experience, I got involved with the government's remote viewing program. Back in the early 70s, there was something called Project Scan8. Scan8 meant scanning by coordinate. They hadn't kind of invented the word remote viewing so much, so they named this thing Scan8, or scanning by remote viewing. What's everybody talking about? That's the launch, is what we hear, the big rumble? Okay, we're all going to have to remote view it, right? I hear a big noise, you know. I see light streaking upward, you know. Okay. Well, you can all say, I heard the big lunge. Okay, somebody's out there videotaping it. Good. Now, the Scan8 mission was to scientifically examine intelligence applications of remote viewing. What was happening here is the CIA had a collection requirement stating that they wanted to know everything that was going on in psychic phenomena around the world, and they found out that there was a lot of funding in the Soviet Union, millions and millions of dollars, mostly from the KGB, done at private and university laboratories. And the mission then of Stanford, being paid by the CIA at that time, was to duplicate that research. It was very hard of an intelligence problem to find out what the results of the Soviet research was. We knew the funding channels, we knew who was working there, but to get the actual results of the research was a very difficult problem. So what we did is we tried to duplicate that research at Stanford to find out what the results of such a thing might be. At that time, two of the principal remote viewers were Ingo Swann and Pat Price. Now, there were more, but those are two of the principal ones, especially on something called Project Scan8. Now, I came along in the late 70s when the Army got involved for security concerns looking at this, and we code-named our program Grill Flame. This program was unique and different than the CIA's program at SRI because I was a member at that time of a unit that went out to various military installations to attack them with our intelligence tools. We would photograph them with overhead satellites. We would intercept their telephone conversations. We would intercept their radio communications. And then we would go to the commander of that United States base and say, this is your profile. This is what you look like to the enemy who collects with these tools today, and counsel him on what kinds of things should be done. Well, about that same time, I was reading the reports and the books out of Stanford on remote viewing and pointed out to my commanders, we weren't doing anything in the world of remote viewing. We weren't telling these people how to protect themselves from this thing called remote viewing. So as a young lieutenant at that time, my boss turned to me and says, well, Lieutenant, what are you going to do about that? How are you going to fix that problem? So after going through lots of briefings and meetings and approvals of appropriate generals and so forth, we set forth a program to train some people to do this thing called remote viewing, to take people that already were employees of the government, screen them, and train them to do this remote viewing so that we might use them in the same way. That is, have them remote view U.S. kinds of systems and present a threat picture saying, if the Soviets are using remote viewers, this is what your installation looks like to them. It was a Army INSCOM and Stanford research relationship at that time. That all started back in 1977 for me. And there I am in my younger days. and I received various military awards for doing such things. I don't think of these as being terribly special. In the military, you're supposed to get a certain amount of awards in a certain time, and when you don't get them is when you're in trouble. So I don't consider these things as being terribly special. So that's kind of who I am and why I'm here. In focusing on Project Scanny, which was over 25 years ago now, these were the players at SRI International. Now, here's a picture of Pat Price, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Pat Price in a minute, but this is a very unique picture because in here we have Pat Price. This is taken at SRI. This is Robert Monroe. And this is Russell Targ. This is a very unique kind of a picture here out at Stanford Research Institute where we have Pat Price, Robert Monroe, and Russell Targ, one of the research scientists at SRI, all in the same place at the same time. It's a real nice little picture. Now, who is this guy named Pat Price? Pat was a fantastic remote viewer. Let me carry this thing with me here. This is what Stansfield Turner said about him. Stansfield Turner was actually quoted as saying this about Pat Price. They had found somebody who could tell them what was going on anywhere in the world through this process of remote viewing. It was a very interesting situation. Now, Pat Price also believed that there were bases, UFO bases, on the planet Earth. Now, let's talk for a minute about, would you believe anybody that walked up to you and said this? You know, we were talking before about, you know, there's a UFO base under my garage. How much credibility would you give if someone walked up to you and said that? Well, when Pat Price came to Hal Puthoff in 1973 and set a file down on Hal Puthoff's desk and says, you might be interested in these UFO bases, we had a tendency to believe him a little bit more than your average guy, because he was able to provide this other information, this other remote viewing information so well. He did such a wonderful job. He had no particular axe to grind. He wasn't looking to be famous. He was retired police commissioner from Burbank, California, I believe. And yet he came in 1973 and put this file on Hal Puthoff's desks saying, you might be interested in these UFO bases. Now, during this time, Hal had been working with Pat Price for a number of years, but Pat Price had been separately recruited by the CIA to work for them exclusively. They thought a lot of him. He was a wonderful, world-class remote viewer. Now, I have to stop here because I like to caution everybody about, is this material valid? Is what we're about to learn real information? Remember how I stressed that, I'm sneaking a peek at my clock here. Remember how I stressed that the definition of remote viewing involved a very structured protocol. You know, you hide the target in the envelope, or you secret this person away in a room and you deny them access to this. They don't know what they're supposed to be telling you. They must remote view it in order to be successful. First of all, nobody asked Pat Price for this information. This was not done in a controlled kind of environment. The results of this were never reported to any government officials in any way. Hal Puthoff just sat on the information in 1973. What do you do with this stuff anyway, you know? Who do you give it to? Kind of a thing. So this is a cautionary note up front. You know, did Pat Price make all this up? We don't know. But he had no axe to grind. He had no reason to make it up. And he had been thoroughly tested and provided wonderful remote viewing information on other things. So there's this tendency to believe him, a man with just wonderful credentials. We called it LIDMAC, loyalty, integrity, discretion, morals, and character. This guy was reputable. You would tend to believe him. And so what did he say? This is kind of an overview of what we're going to talk about today and some of the things that he said about these underground UFO bases. He said that they had a primary purpose, and this had to do with something called reinforced BTL implants, transporting of new recruits, and an overall monitoring function. Now, this is information reported in 1973, over 25 years ago. I do not know what BTL implants are. Somebody said Bell Telephone Labs, but I have no idea what BTL implants are. I asked Dr. Putoff, who was the original person to receive this information, if he knew what BTL implants were, and he said he didn't know either. So no, we don't know what BTL implants are. He said that the occupants of these places looked like Homo sapiens, looked like us. He went on further to say that there was a difference in the lungs and the eyes and so forth, but just to the casual observer, they looked like us. He said they had the ability to use thought transfer and can induce instant sleep and can somehow control people's functions through these advanced mental powers here. That's kind of an overview of what was said. We're going to go into some more depth. So where are these places anyways? Where are these 4 bases that he pointed out in 1973? Okay, Mount Perdido is in the Pyrenees, and that's between France and Spain, this range of mountains here. And if you look up the geographic coordinates, it's kind of almost right where I'm pointing to that little bump right there. That's kind of right about in this range of mountains where Mount Perdido is. Now, this is an interesting place to report where there might be a UFO base. There have been a number of sightings of UFOs around the Pyrenees Mountains, and there's a famous set of caves in the Pyrenees where there are ancient drawings of ancient astronauts, perhaps flying spacecraft and things like that as well. So it's interesting that that came up, but no particular other information about the Pyrenees. Does anybody else have any concept? Has anybody ever heard before of maybe UFO base in the Pyrenees? You know, and I'm asking you, because it's true.
UFO magazine.
Yeah, the article about my talk in UFO magazine, that would have done it too. Okay.
Perdido means lost.
Oh, that's an interesting concept too, isn't it? Mount Perdido. Perdido means lost, and so when they named that mountain, what is the architecture of naming that? That would be an interesting research project, you know. Uh-huh. That would be really interesting to look into. How did that mountain get its name? Did a lot of people get lost there or something? It'd be interesting kind of, never heard that before, but an interesting kind of thing. Any other comments before we move on? Hello.
The Humboldt land is there in the 1950s. There were a group of 8 of them that came to this planet to test the conditions and to check on the situation of what we were, how we were living.
Okay, so there is another report here of some craft landing in the 50s. Okay, to check on things. So there does seem to be some history in the Pyrenees of UFO activity. Looking at that base closer, these are some of the things that were reported by Pat Price about this particular base. He calls them local units, and a propulsion system that looks like, and I put that looks like in italics because it's a comparator. You have to be careful when you deal with remote viewing, when people use similes, metaphors, and comparators, it's like they can't describe it directly, so they use something similar to it. So when he says looks like, we can't say it is artificial electromagnetic field. And there are some sort of detectors. They seem to be worried about being discovered. This is the little sketch he provided of a propulsion system. This is 1973 Pat Pice remote viewing sketch. Remember the sketches that were produced that I showed you before of the dome and of the derrick, the tower, and so forth and so on, and judge this drawing with that kind of accuracy. Has anybody else ever seen some sort of a report or something where they reported a similar kind of propulsion device? Some sort of round thing? I don't know. That's, again, UFOs aren't my specialty, so I don't know. This is a picture of one of the local units, or the UFOs, and it's kind of hard to discern here. Let me see. It's a three-dimensional kind of drawing here. This is laying down. The saucer shape is laying down, and this is the top dome of it, the crown and the keel down here. He's drawn it as though it was transparent. And he says that from the crown to the keel, the center of this saucer-like device would be 40 feet, and the width of it would be 120 feet. Now, is that a reasonable size shape? How big is a regular jet airplane? Is it 120 feet long? Or does that sound like a reasonable shape for a UFO? I don't know. Sometimes I hear things that are as big as football fields and stuff like that. I don't know if this is a good shape or size for a UFO kind of a thing. Pardon? Okay. Okay, the next location that he talked about in these four locations was in what in the country is now called Zimbabwe, and Mount Inyangani, which is right over here. This country is at the southern end of Africa here, South Africa here. It's a landlocked country. This has oceanfront, and this has oceanfront over here. And, of course, South Africa's on the tip. So this is a landlocked country, and Mount Inyangani is right over here. Time for a little drink of water. What did he say about this? There seemed to be kind of a different function to this base, even though all the bases work together. This base looked like it was some sort of a maintenance unit. Parts being welded in a vacuum chamber. Now, again, I'm a really big doubting Thomas here. And it's not because I don't believe in UFOs or remote viewing. I mean, I'm in the business, right? But I don't think these guys flew from, some nebulae 14,000 light years away from now and got a welding torch at Sears and Roebuck. So he seems to be observing something and yet laying on top of it his knowledge of welding. Whether these ships come from other dimensions or other planetary systems in the universe, welding is something that we do locally in our physical world with our physical things. So he might have been looking at something that wasn't exactly welding and yet called it that. Here's some drawings of some things that he saw there, interesting kinds of devices. Somebody said that looks like a Hoover vacuum or something like that. The next site is in Alaska. Mount Hayes in Alaska. Let's see if we can't point it out. I looked up the coordinates on it, and Mount Hayes is probably right there. Mount Hayes in Alaska. Now, about Mount Hayes, Pat Price said that there were similar kinds of security measures. There seemed to be a preoccupation upon the part of the occupants. They did not want to be discovered. Things that they did were not so much menacing or destructive things, but an extreme amount of attention to the idea of not being discovered as to what they were doing. He says he sees an area filled with computer equipment. Now, here's a man who was in his 60s, in the early 70s, and has a technological background of the 50s, and he's labeling this stuff as computers. So he's probably looking at something that he doesn't understand and trying to fit it into a description. Notice how he says there's a section with equipment that look like oscilloscopes. Oscilloscope is a very fancy piece of 1950s equipment. Again, I don't think if these things are extraterrestrial, they're using an oscilloscope they got at Radio Shack. You know, they're looking at what is an oscilloscope. It's a round screen electronic measurement and detection device. And we put the label oscilloscope on that. He was following some of these wires and went to the top of a mountain peak, saw kind of an antenna sort of a thing here. Says that you could rotate this antenna around. And again, they were looking at perhaps detecting radio signals of some kind that would indicate that they themselves had been discovered. It's not like they were, making their own radio broadcasts or their own Saturday night television show, but they were interested in detecting anything that might reveal that they had been discovered. This sounds a little ominous in some cases here, that they are dispatching people to do unusual things. Let's say we were going to launch some sort of a probe that would look over this area of Alaska carefully. They might interfere with that probe. That sounds kind of ominous in some way. Now, this even sounds a little bit more strong, that they have penetrated or infiltrated our government in some way. Not so much to control our government or our processes or the people, but again to prevent detection in some way. Now, I don't know that there's any evidence of this, but I do know a couple of weird-looking people, that every time I see James Carver on the TV, I think about what Pat Price said, and you wonder about the meaning of what he had to say. I mean, we have bizarre behavior and strange-looking kinds of things, He appears almost human, So there could be something here. Now, before going on to the next slide here, I met with Dr. Putoff last spring after I had given this talk and the article in UFO magazine had been written and so forth and so on. And Dr. Putoff said, "Gee, you caused quite a stir." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, people called me and asked me, well, is that really real? Is that really happening?" And Hal and I are real good friends, so and what I'm telling you is really real. I haven't made up anything along the way. This is the way it happened. And I asked Hal over lunch at a local Chinese restaurant, and I said, "Well, do you know any more? Did you ever try to validate any of this? What happened?" And he said, "Well, when Pat Price and I were looking at this material back in 1973, I said to Pat, I said, Pat, Mount Hayes in Alaska, that's easy. You know, we could go up and, you know, just camp up there in the park and hike up Mount Hayes and find these things, you know. And then Pat Price said, well, it's not going to be all that easy because they conceal these things. They fly into the mountain, and it's not like they have a garage door opener from Kmart, you know. They seem to be able to manipulate physical matter in a way that we don't know, and so you probably would never find them, even if you saw one day exactly where they went and you hiked up there to find where they were gone. You might not even be able to see it because of the way they deal with physical matter. So that was something I learned in talking with Dr. Putoff just last spring about something that happened back in 1973, so that was kind of fun. Now, Mount Zeal. Mount Zeal is down in Australia, in the northern territories of Australia. I'm going to the pointer here so I can point to Mount Zeal right there. Now, Mount Zeal seemed to have even a different kind of a function here. He called it the Personnel Center. It was an interesting description to call something a personnel center. He didn't call it the alien center. He called it personnel. They seemed to find different kinds of people from all the different sites here. Something very interesting happened to him while he was there. It was as though they detected his remote viewing presence. He came out and said, you know, oh, they know I'm here. And so he ran off to Melbourne to visit somebody in Melbourne, hoping that if they were able to follow him in some way in his remote viewing mode, that they would be led back to Melbourne and not to his home. Kind of an interesting sort of a notion, isn't it, that you'd be able to detect someone there in their remote viewing presence. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. I have myself, in working with the remote viewers that I've worked in, had some of them report similar kinds of things to me. And if you look at the physics behind it in any system, you know, in the Schrodinger situation, you know, is the cat dead if you open the box or not? You never know until you open the box. In the Schrodinger equations, the idea is that the physical world depends upon being observed, the observer effect. So if we observe the physical world with remote viewing, the physical world is therefore modified by that observance, and perhaps then it might be able to detect when a physical piece of space is being remote viewed, because it would change. So he goes back to the site after throwing them off and says there are vehicles here. Says there are different kind of IDs on the units. And Mount Zeal has personnel for all the bases. He says that we ought to approach this area with caution, again, because he was detected there and because these folks seem to be very, very concerned about being detected. So we ought to approach those with caution. So he decides to go look elsewhere at that point in time. Now, is any of this true that Pat Price told us? Does it make any sense to anybody? I don't know. Certainly is a fascinating story. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. Pat Price was a trusted kind of a guy. In the case of the Pyrenees Mountains, it seems to parallel other sightings that happened in the Pyrenees Mountains. Interestingly, in the case of Mount Zeal, last spring when I had lunch with Hal Putoff, he said, well, you know, I need to tell you something else about the Australia site. I said, well, what's that, Hal? And he said, well, back in 1973 when Pat brought me this folder, I happen to know, this is Hal Puthoff talking at this time, I happen to know the CIA station chief down in this area in northern Australia. And so I decided to call him up and ask him what was going on. We're driving in the car on the way to the restaurant, and he says, and so I called him up and I asked him, I said, hey, is there anything unusual going on down there? And then Pat reached over in the car and touched me on the shoulder and assured me, says, no, I didn't make any suggestions at all. I could have been talking about Aborigine religious rights or kangaroos dying or anything. I had made no suggestions. And the CIA station chief answered back to Hal Puthoff, no, this is really a dead assignment. There's not much going on here at all. It's just kind of, watching things, making sure everything goes just fine. And, other than all those UFOs around Mount Zeal, there's nothing happening down here. So Hal was like, okay. So that's a kind of an interesting sort of a story, again, that I just learned last spring. And Hal didn't say anything more to him or telling him anything more. But here I am. Hal Puthoff passed this folder to me, passed this information to me in the early 80s. After having met each other in 1977, and my job was to put together a cadre of people, a crew of people, remote viewers that could do this remote viewing for the government in this security purposes kind of thing that I told you about. Hal Puthoff and I became friends, and he handed me this pack of information with all this in it and said, here, you might be interested in this. And I'm like, okay. And so I go home and read it and look at it and explain it to myself just as I've explained it to you. And so, I ask myself, is any of this true at all? And I ask myself a little deeper as well. Here are some questions that I kind of ask myself. If there really are underground UFO bases at these 4 sites, are they made of physical matter? Could you actually go there and touch a UFO and walk around one and get into one and so forth and so on? Are they made of this stuff, this physical matter? Or is it kind of flexible for them? Can they do what they want with physical matter? The reason that I asked myself this question, and it was of direct concern for me, is because of my own personal encounter with a UFO where I was riding on the ship and asking the folks that were giving me the ride, I said, well, how do you get from here to there? And the answer was, you wouldn't understand. And I said, okay, I can dig that. I'm just an ignorant little human. Try me. Try to explain it to me so I can understand it. And they answered back to me, well, you have something called the Rubik's Cube. Do you know what a Rubik's Cube is? And I said, sure, I know what a Rubik's Cube is. Incidentally, my eldest son can do that thing in 2 minutes. I don't know how he does it. But I said, yeah, I know what a Rubik's Cube is. And he said, well, do you know what a periodic table is? And I said, sure, I remember learning that in chemistry. It's a list of all the elements and atomic weights. He said, okay. Now imagine putting that periodic table on the surface of a Rubik's Cube. I said, okay. And he says, now imagine that there is similar periodic tables on the other surfaces of the Rubik's Cube. Okay, I'm stretching my imagination a little bit. And he says, the way we go from one place to another is we twist the Rubik's Cube. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? And he says, well, you think about, going this direction for this length of time at this speed is the way to get from here to there. All we do is twist the Rubik's Cube, which alters the reality, the physics makeup, and we are at that other place. So the way they tune into us is just on their navigation system, they tune their Rubik's Cube to our physics, and they're here. They don't even think about it in terms of go that direction at this speed for this number of years or whatever. They were right, I didn't understand. So I'm asking myself, even if these things are real, are they made of physical matter? Would I be able to understand it? Do they have some sort of a stealth technology that would prevent us from detecting them? I mean, obviously we have radar and visible aircraft right now. We have lots of stealth technology that's within our capabilities. We have, special kinds of radio signals that can't even be detected as well. So maybe they have some sort of stealth technology that you could be standing next to one right there and not see it. How about these mental powers? Do they have unusual mental powers? Could they have a nice visit with you, give you a ham sandwich for lunch, and then hypnotize you and say you were never here? So there were problems that I was thinking about, and how can we find out? How can we find out whether or not these four bases really exist? I mean, I trust Pat Price, no reason to lie, loyalty, integrity, discretion, morals, and character, wonderful. Nothing to gain by this, a proven remote viewer. And so personally, I'm like ready to hike up the mountain and go find out. Despite all of these other things, I'm ready to go. Let's go find out what these things are all about. But at this time in my life, in the early 1980s, I'm not free to go do that. I'm not even free to go do that right now. But I did have something else, another tool at my disposal in the early 1980s. Remote viewing. Here I was, an intelligence officer with a cadre of highly trained, skilled remote viewers, the ability to perceive beyond the confines of space and time and give me descriptions of things. Part of the training that I put them through was to challenge their perceptual abilities. I mean, pretty soon a remote viewer can remote view McDonald's in the bowling alley and the missile base and the submarine building. They can do that. And you begin to say, what are the limits of this remote viewing? Let's make them flex their muscles a little bit. Let's challenge this perceptual venue and develop individualized skills within the remote viewers. So we developed a package of training targets that would challenge them. And by challenge, I'll give you an example. Out in San Francisco, there's a natural history museum that is a spiral museum that you walk through this spiral. And on one side, you might be looking at a 1950s kitchen and a wax model of a housewife and a husband in the kitchen. But when you turn around and look across the way, there's Neanderthal man sitting there with, an egg that he just found in a nest someplace. You take the remote viewer and plop him down in the middle of this to see whether or not he can figure this out. This very strange place with all these different things to perceive and understand. Let's see if they can figure that out. Another challenge-type target was a miniatures museum down in Tennessee. It was like an art gallery, except there were very delicately hand-carved miniatures that were back in the wall, kind of like in fish tank style back in the wall. And so you'd plop a remote viewer down in the middle of that and watch them try to figure this place out. I'm in the middle of a big room and there's people here. This reminds me of a museum or an art gallery. They all seem to be focusing on something in the wall. Hey, what happened? Everybody's really big around. What happened to me? Well, they, fall into the miniaturized picture, look back at the people, and suddenly they're all giants. So the question is can the remote viewer be challenged enough in his perceptions to figure out what's going on here? Under this authority, then, to train people in challenging targets and to identify individual skills, test the accuracy of these skills, develop people that could look at things. For example, some of the remote viewers could be used really well against nuclear targets. They always knew when there was a nuclear power plant or nuclear weapons facility. They could tell when it was there. Others didn't seem to be able to detect the nuclear component at all. So there were ways to train and ways to test remote viewers in their own individual skills. Under this authority then, as the operations training officer in the early 1980s, I pulled Dr. Putoff's old file out of the drawer and said, well, here are some interesting targets to look at. I wonder what would happen if I used these as targets, as training targets. What kinds of perceptions, how skilled are the remote viewers at these kinds of things? And if they tell me that there's UFO stuff there, then that's going to kind of corroborate what Pat Price had to say. It's not going to be what we might call real-world data. It's not like we hiked up the mountain and took a picture of it. But it is some sort of tendency to kind of corroborate. I wonder what will happen. I'm sorry, we're out of time. I put this slide up here because I have another cautionary note here. This particular situation was my doing. There was no CIA, Pentagon kind of tasking to do this. And that's a logical thing to be thinking, because I am now a military officer working in a military secret program using remote viewing, but not all the things I did were tasked by outside agencies. These kind of training things I came up with. None of the information I'm about to share with you was reported in any way to any government official. It was simply a training kind of thing to be done. But it was done under strict protocol. I didn't say to the remote viewers, tell me about the UFO base at Mount Hayes. I did not do that, What I actually did was take a map of Alaska, mark Mount Hayes with an X on it, put that map in a sealed envelope, set that envelope on the table, and say to the remote viewers, describe the location indicated in the sealed envelope. So it was a controlled situation. It wasn't 1-800, give me a psychic reading on Mount Hayes. Time for me to get another little drink. Joe McMoneagle. How many have heard of Joe McMoneagle? Good. His new book called The Perfect Time Machine is due to be published in November now. It should be out in November. I cannot do justice to Joe McMoneagle's remote viewing of Mount Hayes without reading to you his verbatim words. And so I'm kind of apologizing up front because you're never supposed to read to an audience. I'm going to lose eye contact with you and all that. But I cannot say it as well as Joe said it in his original words. Okay. Before I describe the pictures that I drew, I have to make a statement. You have to bear in mind that my descriptions and everything and what they lack, because I can't find I find a lot of difficulty in describing any of this because I've never, ever seen anything that remotely resembles part of this target. This target is, I've never seen anything like it before. It's not just something you can describe. It's like It's like walking me into a place that I have no familiarity with at all. I mean, I don't even recognize screws and bolts in this thing. It's just completely off the wall as far as a target. So I have nothing to relate to. I have nothing to present as I envisioned it. I asked the question of him, what do you mean by off the wall? It's all brand new. It never existed before. This is a prototype of something, some complete new concept. It's like asking an Aborigine who has never seen an automobile to crawl inside an automobile and then describe in his terms what an automobile is when he has no vocabulary, no terms for screws and bolts and seat covers and windows and glass and metal. Even the most rudimentary parts of this thing have no terms for them. Now that's kind of the position I'm in. I have seen something and I don't have the rudimentary terms to describe it. I believe the target is placed deep inside this mountain range. He starts to describe his drawings. I believe that the target is placed deep inside this mountain range in this desolate area, and that it's virtually almost impossible to discover its exact location. It was put there with great deliberation. Notice that the drawing here, I was amazed when I compared this with a drawing of Alaska. Whoops, I'm going to go back. I thought I was pointing at it and I was clicking the slide here. This is water down here, ice up above, a desolate area out here, mountains. Remember the map of Alaska that I put up there before? That's kind of an interesting exact replication of what Alaska is from a remote viewer's perspective. Now, he went on to say, I perceived underground tubes feeding into some tunnels, small ball-shaped objects that are very large and deep and round. This whole thing is underground and powered by something like an atomic power plant. Now, I don't get the feeling an aggressive nature to this target. I get a defensive nature to the target. I don't sense the presence of individuals at the target. I almost get a feeling this is just put there, sealed off, which is really strange. It was like a great deal of care was used in putting it there very secretively. I get one of those Star Wars feelings. Now, Joe went on to draw some... Did I push the wrong button? Joe went on to draw some kinds of protective shell or intercept kind of radio sorts of things that surrounded this. If you ask Joe McMonagle today, hey, do you remember the Alaska site? He will say, gee, that seemed more like some sort of a radio intercept site or some sort of a place, you know, NSA would put something up there. I don't remember anything about UFOs, and he didn't. In this particular site, he didn't. He just said this was so strange he could not describe it, didn't know what it was, and then gave us these rudimentary kinds of sketches. So here we have a kind of interesting dilemma here. I think I went backwards. Now, Mel Riley, another remote viewer. Mel Riley's summary. Site appears to be a structure located within a mountain, which is a triangular peak. There's a large lake at the base of this mountain, which is surrounded by high, rugged mountains or cliffs. It seems fairly impenetrable. there were two people walking around outside of the structure and two people inside of the structure. One of the people inside the structure sat at a circular position which appeared to look similar to an organ because of keys, buttons, and switches. The word observing comes to mind, and there appeared to be some sort of screen or monitor, but I couldn't make it out clearly. When I saw this drawing from Mel Riley, it made me think of the oscilloscope description given by Pat Price, this idea of some sort of a round sort of a screen that you might look into to detect signals in some way. So let's summarize a little bit about this data. Going back to the Pat Price data, remember that nobody asked Pat Price to provide this data. His descriptions were not controlled. There weren't sealed enveloped kinds of exercises or anything else. He just showed up with this information. But they do describe 4 subterranean locations. He, in general, says that they are highly protected from discovery. They seem to know about each other, and they support each other. The purpose of them is to do something with BTL implants. Don't know what that is. Transport of new recruits and an overall monitoring function. Okay, 1973 information, unsolicited, provided by Pat Price. How about information provided by highly trained remote viewers, done under appropriate protocols where they didn't know what they were supposed to describe? Now, I've only shown you 2 of the sites because of time, but I used remote viewers to go back and look at all of the sites. There seems to be a confirmation that there is at least some sort of a very high technology something going on at these 4 locations. At least that, some sort of a high technology something going on. The later sites, somebody hit the volume control there. The later sites describe these as being protected, mutually supported, and very high technology, very similar to what Pat Price said. The purpose of these sites is observation, perhaps navigational. The sites might not always be occupied. You know, when Pat Price was there was 73, there seemed to be a lot of activity, and you had to watch out, and so forth and so on. The detection by the 1980 remote viewers reported that sometimes they weren't occupied. Now, I made a gross mistake when I targeted this information with my remote viewers back in the early 80s. Since remote viewing can be used across time and across space, it's very, very important when you target a remote viewer that you assign a specific location and a specific time. If you don't do that, their perceptions might be anywhere in time. You don't know for sure. There are simply hundreds of examples where remote viewers provided an accurate description of a location in a different time window. It's hard for us to conceive of that, because if you're, trying to say, describe the location at 63 degrees north, 27 degrees west, in our minds we think, oh, well, that's the big water tower. But across all of time, it wasn't always a water tower. So from the remote viewer's perspective, you always have to target a time. And I wasn't careful when I targeted these back in the early 80s to assign a specific time. There's kind of the assumption that they describe it today, right now, the time that you ask them to, but that doesn't guarantee it. You must include that in the targeting if you want to guarantee that. But let's talk about this idea of not being occupied for a minute. there is a concept that UFOs have been visiting the Earth probably for thousands of years. And they've been observing and watching our civilizations grow. They probably aren't there all the time. You know, they probably don't go out to Dunkin' Donuts and get a cup of coffee every 10 years. It seems to me if we examine our own behavior, how do we observe, you know, tribal activity in a third world country? How do we observe this? We don't sit and watch the ant farms build their farm. You know, we go back and check on it once a day or something. So it's entirely possible that some sort of extraterrestrial civilization checks in every now and then, but does not, they aren't a 24/7 kind of a crew, you know, they aren't there all the time. That's a possibility. Now, the last thing here is one of the remote viewers reported that there were more of these bases and some on the seabed. That was Joe McMonagle, who just kind of threw that in. He said, you know, there's a lot more of these, and there are some on the seabed, too. Well, there has been a lot of UFO data reported about seeing craft fly into the ocean, fly into lakes, and so forth and so on. So that might be possible, too. So, do you want to learn about remote viewing? You want to know how to do it for yourself? I always like to tell people, in the words of Robert Monroe, and that's the only way to know is to find out for yourself, you know. Don't believe anything I've told you. Don't believe anything you read. Go find out for yourself. These are a couple people I recommend for learning how to do remote viewing for yourself. So if you want to learn more about this remote viewing process, learn how to do it yourself, you might give these people a call. I'll leave that slide on there for a couple minutes. Okay. Just a second. The next slide is this. So it's time for questions and answers. I'm going back to this slide so you can copy down the stuff. Yes?
Microphone, please.
Yes, this is time for questions. So if you have any questions, and I hope you do, please go to the microphone so that it'll be recorded on the audio tape.
Mr. Atwater, I'd like to add something to what you have been talking about to add additional credence to your presentation. In a world where mainstream science is on one side of the fence and researchers into the paranormal and ufology are on the other side, this whole area of remote viewing is one of the few areas that I know of where the two come together. The two laser physicists, Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, published the research that they did at Stanford Research Institute in two mainstream publications. One was the IEEE Journal, which is the Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineers, and the other one was in Nature magazine. These were groundbreaking publications. They published the results of the test that they did with Pat Price and with Ingo Swann, without naming them by name. The diagrams that they did in remote viewing in the Menlo Park area are in the papers. You can go to any engineering library in any university in the United States and find these two papers. Also, Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ did similar experiments with Uri Geller. And this involved transmutation of elements, dematerialization of things, and that was published in a book called the Geller Papers. And I challenge any of you to look these papers up. I can't cite the names of the papers because it's about 20 words long, but if you go to your library and look up the book Mind Reach, you'll find these two papers referenced there.
Thank you for your comment. It was the scientific validity of their research that made it so easy for me to get involved in this military program. I mean, when you bring the research and set it out in front of your bosses, they couldn't deny it. It was there. That's what made it so easy.
I have one other comment that might be of interest. In the paper that was presented in the IEEE Journal, there's a footnote that said it was based on research funded by NASA.
Could you explain again who gave you the information about the Rubik's Cube? That type?
Sure. I have had several personal encounters myself. On one of those encounters, I was on board a spacecraft, and the pilot of the spacecraft, the occupants of the spacecraft, were the ones who described the Rubik's Cube scenario to me in an attempt to explain something that I wouldn't be able to understand, in an attempt to use pieces of my own knowledge so that I might try to grasp what they were talking about.
By remote viewing or by abduction?
That's really a good question. I was not attempting to remote view them. I was suddenly with them. Now, yeah. I think what the question in the back of the room is not recording over the microphone, and I think, if I understand what you're saying, is was this perception that I was having of the pilots of the spacecraft, was it a remote viewing kind of perception, or was it an abduction situation? I would rephrase that question, because I still am wrestling in my mind whether abduction experiences are out-of-the-body experiences or are they physical flesh experiences. And I don't have a good answer for that, because I can stand on one side of the argument and argue, yeah, 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 and I can stand on the other side of the argument and argue, yeah, 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 yeah. But I haven't yet dealt with that in my mind as to, is it one or is it the other? And I'm now, right now as I stand before you, thinking maybe as a human I'm asking the wrong question. And I don't know what that means.
Yes, Skip. Most people that are familiar with remote viewers know who Lynn Buchanan is.
Yes.
But I've never heard of Paul Smith. Is he somebody you worked with in the government?
Yeah, Paul Smith was one of the original remote viewers. He's now retired, lives in Austin, Texas, and teaches remote viewing. Yes, Paul Smith was one of the remote viewers.
Well, the last time I checked about Lynn Buchanan, he had like a 5-year waiting list on his school, so that was when he was doing in Washington. You have any idea about that?
No, I don't.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yep, I think Lynn, he was doing around the country now that he's in New Mexico. I think he's trying to do them every 2 weeks. I don't think he has that waiting list like that anymore.
Yeah, again, I don't know, but there's the information to call and find out about that.
Joe McMonagle and Mind Trek did an incredible session on Cydonia, which he says he doesn't know if it's accurate or not, but it's very detailed with pyramids. And Paul Smith, through an email, related one of his remote viewings he did on the moon.
Yes.
Said he came up with very strange structures.
Yes.
What do you know as far as the other remote viewers, as far as sessions on Cydonia, the moon, and what's your personal feeling on the stories about Pat Price still being alive and working for the CIA?
Oh, good questions. Yes, no, 3 from column A and 2 from column B. The questions put forth are very interesting, and we have little time to deal with them. First of all, I know nothing about the operations done against structures on the moon. I know nothing about that. I wasn't involved with that. I don't know anything about it. Number 2, the remote viewing of the Mars site with Joe McMonagle. In the early 80s, we had a classified contract with Robert Monroe to train Joe McMonagle in deep meditative concentration in an attempt to improve his remote viewing skills. It was a 10-week training program. The amount of dollars is still classified, so I can't tell you that. One of my tasks during that 10-week period of time was to run calibration sessions every week to see how the training was going and see if there was any improvement over time. Dr. Hal Puthoff gave me a list of Mars coordinates that had unusual objects detected. And I, while Joe was at the Monroe Institute, used those targets as one of those calibration situations. The way I actually did it was to write on a 3x5 card. I actually have, as a collector's item, this still 3x5 card I used. I said, the planet Mars, 1 million years BC. And I put that 3x5 card in a sealed envelope. And as Joe McMoneagle went into the adjacent room, I put that sealed envelope in Robert Monroe's breast pocket of his jacket. And when Joe said that he was ready to go, I read him a coordinate saying, focus your attention on the location in the envelope, describe this coordinate. And he began describing the structures on the planet Mars. This is all documented in Joe's book, Mind Trek. It was a clean, well-run experiment. At one point, Joe said, gee, the sun looks funny. And I immediately said, turn left and go to the next coordinate. I didn't want him to discover why the sun looked funny to him. And he described these structures and an ancient civilization on Mars. The reason that the civilization was destroyed was because of a cataclysmic astronomical event like a comet or an asteroid stripped the atmosphere from the planet and the civilization was wiped out instantly. In probing deeper using remote viewing skills, the people seemed to know that this was about to happen to them and prepared this place in the pyramids so that perhaps some civilization millions of years later would discover that they were still there. Next question, the Pat Price issue. I'm sorry, yeah. There's some question. Pat Price reportedly died in 1975, and there's some question about his death surrounding that time because he was involved with the CIA. And everything they do is spooky, right? Now, I've read what was said on what's been said on the website about that, and it tells kind of an interesting story about people being afraid to say certain things. I asked Hal Puthoff years ago, I said, tell me about Pat Price and his death and everything, and Pat kind of said, well, I said, well, tell me about, what you think. And he said, well, Pat had told some of his close friends that he thought he was going to be poisoned. And nobody took any notion of it. When his wife, he supposedly keeled over in a restaurant having a cup of coffee. When his wife went to the hospital, this is Hal Puthoff telling me this story, when his wife went to the hospital to find him and identify the body, the hospital personnel said that, his body has already been claimed and it has been taken to the funeral home. So she went to the funeral home and there was something that looked like Pat Price. Hal Puthoff actually went to the funeral and saw a body that looked like Pat Price in the coffin. And as he tells me this story, but a death mask isn't that hard to create. Nobody ever could identify or find out who were the people who claimed the body and took it to the funeral home. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. I put Pat Price's picture in a sealed envelope. And during one of these training sessions, asked Joe McMonagle to describe the location of the person in the sealed envelope. And the first thing Joe said was, "Hey, this guy does just what I do." And I said, "Well, that's interesting, Joe. Describe his location." "Well, he's in a secret underground place in Virginia someplace." Now, if Pat Price were alive today, he'd be in his very late 80s. Unless he was cloned or something, I don't know. The CIA pulls some interesting shenanigans. I have no proof. I don't know anything. A man with Pat Price's ability would certainly be worthwhile pulling some shenanigans to make him disappear. But I don't know. I don't have any proof one way or the other. We have 1 minute. Can you go with the questions?
Today, terrorist activity is a worldwide concern.
Yes.
Could or is remote viewing being used to ascertain attempts and places and persons in that field?
Could, the answer is yes. Is, I don't know. That the remote viewing world with the government is a past life experience for me. I don't know. Last question, quickly, please.
What percentage of remote viewers identify with and view from the perspective of UFOs?
Interesting situation. There are a couple of people around who have kind of, in my opinion, gone off the deep end with the remote viewing and UFO situation. And so it's hard to determine truth from fiction unless it's done in a very kind of controlled fashion. You know, if I bring you into the room and say, "Well, Charlie, we're going to be remote viewing UFOs today, so tell me about the one in Texas," and it's like, that's so much front-loading and so much imagination and so much impressions get laid over the data, you can't tell. As far as I know, there is one group run by Stephen Greer who has done some training with remote viewing in an attempt to detect or attract UFO sightings and landings. But in terms of any sort of consolidated effort to collect information, I don't know of anybody doing that, but I think it's a really good idea. Okay, my time is up. They're going to bring the hook and drag me off here real quick.
Was a military intelligence officer and retired from the service. And that included, as you heard yesterday, 10 years of working with the military's remote viewing program, working with SRI International and some of the early leaders of that program, such as Ingo Swann and Pat Price. And so those were part of his background and experience as well. But his whole interest in expanding consciousness, he says, really began probably 30 years ago. In fact, not long after he got graduated from college with his training in counseling psychology. And although he was in the middle of all this remote viewing stuff, which I think in itself would be pretty exciting, he says his real education began when he joined the Monroe Institute. And I think many of you are aware of the Monroe Institute, and in fact we're watching a tape, those of you who came early enough a few minutes ago, about its ability using this hemisync process to enhance things like tuition, psychic and remote viewing abilities, out-of-body experiences, alien contacts, and telepathic and spiritual experiences. It seems to facilitate a lot of those. And so today we're going to have a chance to learn a little bit more about Monroe Institute and what it means to have enhanced consciousness. And won't you join me and welcome me bright and early this morning, Skip Atwater.
If you weren't here last night, hello for the first time. This morning I'm going to talk a little bit about the Monroe Institute and about my kinds of adventures, how I got involved with the Monroe Institute, and kind of tell you some stories about what goes on there. And we're going to spend a very brief time getting very deep into the technology so that you just have an idea about the technology that's involved there. But it will get pretty deep, but I'll try to stay as brief as possible at those depths. As I always start out by telling you what I'm going to tell you, this is what I'm going to tell you about the Monroe Institute. We're going to define what we mean by consciousness, examine the components of what consciousness is. What do we mean by altering this thing called consciousness? We'll talk about hemisync as one of the processes that you might use to alter consciousness, and then as we end up talking about the programs that are offered at the Monroe Institute. Now, Monroe Institute was founded by Robert Monroe, who is most famous for his 3 books, Journeys Out of the Body, Far Journeys, and The Ultimate Journey, and I'm sure most of you have heard of those books before. This is the slide that isn't there, so everything's just fine. The legacy that Bob Monroe leaves us throughout his lifetime is the concept that we are, in fact, more than our physical bodies. But he leaves it up to you to find out what that means. In all of his work at the Institute and in all of his books, he is always saying, you know, don't believe what I'm saying. You need to go and find out for yourself. The only way to know is to find out for yourself. This is the overview of what the Monroe Institute is. I work down here in the Bob Monroe Research Lab. The programs that we hold are in the Nancy Penn Center, and this lecture I'm giving you this morning is usually done in David Francis Hall. So you were getting a little virtual trip to the Monroe Institute here by hearing this lecture here. We also have a new retreat center on top of the mountain, and we're going to run our first program at the new retreat center the end of this month. Now, how did I first meet Bob Monroe? I, as you heard yesterday, was involved in the government's remote viewing program. And there came a time when my job was to look at ways that we could enhance the remote viewer's ability to do remote viewing. There's one theory about remote viewing that says that if you get into a very relaxed, receptive state, that ought to make these weak psychic signals have more volume, as it were, and come to the level of awareness, past the lemon, the barrier between unconscious and consciousness, through the threshold up to consciousness, if we could just quiet down the outside world. And so the Monroe Institute processes seem to offer this. So I went down in April 1977 to meet with Bob Monroe, not telling him everything that I was involved with the government, but that we were certainly interested in his process and what we thought about it. Also, kind of as an aside, like when I moved out to the East Coast, my mother said, "Oh, you're going to the East Coast. Why don't you look up this guy named Bob Monroe? He wrote this very interesting book." Well, you know, that's kind of like saying, I'm going to Europe this summer, and someone says, "Oh, well, I know somebody in Europe. Say hi for me." You know, it's like, you know, there's like millions of people in Europe and on the East Coast. So, at any rate, I read Bob Monroe's book. There was only one book at that time, Journeys Out of the Body, and it rang true for me. It seemed very familiar to kinds of experiences that I had had in childhood. I remember in junior high school time, that kind of awkward time of socialization and growing up, and women are developing breasts and so forth and so on. It's a matter of kind of, how are you going to fit in with this? Well, I found it a lot easier to just jump out the bedroom window and fly around at night and meet with all my friends rather than be in the school situation. So I had strong memories of that. And I told Bob, sitting on the grass out by his farmhouse at Whistlefield, of these adventures that I'd had in childhood, and that I could identify with his book and the things he wrote about in his book. But he had a curious kind of grin, and he said, "Well, you know, In my laboratory over here in this other building, I can get people to talk about their experiences while they're going on. That I play these sound patterns for them, and they get into these perfect receptive states, and they can actually talk and describe their experiences while they happen. And that sounded really strange to me. I'd never thought about talking about this while I was going on. I was off on the adventure. And I very innocently asked him, I said, well, Mr. Monroe, how do you do that? And he was a big gruff man, and he said, well, kid, we'll just have to show you. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be neat. I'll get to go into the laboratory, and I'll be the proverbial fly on the wall, and I'll get to watch this secret experiment and see how this is done and everything. And as we walked down the hallway, I could see that on the right there was a room with lots of knobs and dials and switches and so forth in it. And we walked down to another door, and there was a plain room there, but with a peculiar bed that was built back into the wall. And then I came to understand that Bob had a different idea about showing me what this was all about. He told me to go lay down in the bed there and that he would play some music for me. And I said, well, this sounds really strange. This was a very plain, ordinary room, except that the bed was built into the wall rather than sticking out in the middle of the floor. I mean, all in our bedrooms, the bed comes out into the room. So I laid down, and there was a set of headphones, and I put it on, and then he said, okay, we'll talk to you later. And he switched out the lights and closed the door, and I noticed that the room was totally dark. There were no windows in the room at all. And there I was in what I thought at the time was a very simple bed, a cot, really, with just a little thin mattress on it, listening on these headphones. And he put on this rather strange kind of music, and it turned out to be by the composer Tomita. You probably have heard of the composer Tomita, but in 1977, to me, a military officer, that was pretty strange music. And after a while, the music kind of faded away, and I could hear some surf playing in the background. And then Bob Monroe's voice came on and said, well, this is the sound of surf, the natural power of sound, a symbol here at the Monroe Institute. And I'm like, okay, well, but I was from California, and surf was an okay thing, and I could get into surf, you know, and so I'd listen as the waves would crash, and they'd come and they'd go. You know, when the waves recede back into the ocean, the sand has little, like, bubbles that pop up in it. It makes kind of a hissing or snapping sound as the air comes up from the sand. Well, there seemed to be one last wave that came in and crashed and receded out, and all that was left was just this little hissing or popping sound. And I kept like, well, when's the next wave coming in? You know, I had this vision in my mind of what was going on. I couldn't tell when the next wave was coming, but I began to hear a kind of a droning in the background, a kind of going on in the background. I'm like, what in the world is that? Thinking about it. And then the strangest thing happened. The bed began to rise off of the floor and go up to the ceiling. And I realized that this room was not as plain as I thought it was. You know, it's like when you get the oil changed in your car. He had a thing that pushed the bed up to the ceiling, and one of those knobs in the other room that I had passed must be the knob that you turn to raise the bed up. And I started thinking, I wonder how strong this thing is, you know? And how did they put it in here anyway? They must have had a big drill or something, and they came in. I had all these imaginings. Could I get one in my garage so that maybe I could change my oil with this thing, you know, kind of thing? And I'm thinking about all this. And as those thoughts kind of left my mind and I got bored with that, I perceived myself to be traveling somewhere. And suddenly Bob Monroe's voice came on and said, what's been going on? And I said, well, I seem to be going somewhere. And he said, well, where are you going, kid? And I'm like, I don't know. You know, it feels like I'm going somewhere. Well, pretty soon I could perceive myself kind of inside of a flavor straw. You know what a flavor straw is? Remember this kind of a straw with, you suck milk through it or water and it would turn it to something sweet? Well, it was like being inside of a flavor straw because there were these like gnarly things sticking out from the walls, and I was going about warp 7 down this flavor straw. And I don't know how long, you know, that went on, but I do remember coming to the end of it, there must have been some sort of a curve, because I can remember the kinesthetic feeling of kind of arching my back like that and going back as I got to the end. And just as I reached the top of this flavor straw, my whole perception of where I was, who I was, switched, and I was in a large, white, open, vast space with no walls. But I was watching myself come out of the end of this flavor straw. And I was like, oh, you know, there's all this huge meaning, like wherever you go, there you are, you know. And I came all this way to find out I was still here. And I must have said something. My voice must have said, oh, or look at this, you know, kind of thing. Because Bob Monroe's voice came over my earphones and said, well, what's happening? And I'm like, whoa, where are you? You know, kind of thing. I had long since forgotten about Bob Monroe and the laboratory and all that other kind of thing. And I don't remember too much more. This all happened back in 1977. I don't remember too much more about that. But Bob said, well, I think we ought to go to lunch now. You ready to go to lunch? And he turned down the volume and lowered the bed down to the floor again and came bursting in the room, turned on the light, and, okay, let's go to lunch. Where do you want to go to lunch? We can go down to the greasy hamburger place, we can get a hamburger down there, or we can go down the county seat if you want. What do you want for lunch? And I'm like, man, what has happened anyways? And I turn around, you know, in the bed, and I'm looking underneath the bed like this, and I'm looking for that piston, and he says to me, what, did you drop your watch down there or something? And I'm like, what in the world just happened? There's just a plain cement floor. This thing is built with 2x4s and a piece of plywood. And I'm like, man, what just happened? And we're walking down the hall getting outside. Now, he's being smart. He wants me outside in the fresh air, moving around, getting me grounded, right? So he's being real smart. But I'm still like in the ozone, not understanding exactly what happened. And he's saying to me in his loud, boisterous voice, well, where do you want to go for lunch? You know, we can do this, we can do that, and so forth. And in my mind, now I never said this to him, but in my mind I was thinking, if I could get a six-pack of this stuff, it would be really great, you know, kind of thing. Well, that was my encounter some 20 years ago with Bob Monroe, and it kind of convinced me that this technology that he had was pretty powerful. It really worked. And I obviously went on and did another 10 years with the government and then retired and went to work for Bob Monroe. And so I am now the director of research at the Monroe Institute. Anything works for me, you know, that's the way it works. Let's talk about this thing called consciousness now, because this conference is about, this meeting this morning is about the Monroe Institute and about exploring these altered states of consciousness. But we have to have a kind of an agreement between you and I about what do we mean by consciousness anyway. You know, we don't want to, there's so many definitions, you know, like there's Gaia consciousness and God consciousness and the collective unconscious. And let's simplify all of that down and just say, you know, my first-person experience with the world is somehow reflective of my state of consciousness. The way I experience the world, my first-person experience of the world. Now, sometimes that can be zero, right? You can be clicked out. You say, well, I don't remember anything. Well, that in itself is the experience of not remembering anything. So let's just talk about it in these general terms of your first-person experience with the world. Now, you have to look at then what are the components, what makes up this thing called consciousness. And again, we're going to talk about the two things that make up consciousness involve a balance between something called a level of arousal and a content of consciousness. Now, you can think about this like a radio. Okay, a radio has a volume control, and you might call that the level of arousal, how loud you're going to turn up the volume control. Whereas it also has a channel changer, and that's the content. So consciousness has these two knobs, different levels of arousal, but different contents too. And it's together that they make up your first-person experience of the world. It's together that constitute your first-person experience. So how might you then change that? Well, obviously you got to tilt the scales one way or the other. If you change the level of arousal, then your first-person experience is different. If you change the content of your consciousness, then your first-person experience is different. In thinking about this thing called levels of arousal, there are some basic terms that psychophysiologists use. The basic rest activity cycle. We all go through a 90-minute ebb and flow and changing of arousal. Okay? We're wide awake and alert right now, but after lunchtime we're going to be like, oh man, I got to go to a lecture today, and I really like to go take a nap, you know. So there's this ebb and flow of activity called the basic rest activity cycle. In the evening that becomes our sleep cycle. There's other ultradian rhythms, ultradian meaning less than 24 hours. There's other ultradian rhythms that happen. You're kind of more right-brainy sometimes and more left-brainy sometimes. More right-brainy sometimes, more left-brainy sometimes. There's other kinds of ultradian cycles. But that isn't the only thing that regulates arousal level. Even if you're in a real low kind of arousal level, sense organs, sound, a sense organ can change your arousal level. Bright flashing lights, anything that has to do with our senses can change our arousal level too. That isn't the only system that regulates arousal. There's another one that has to do with memories and feelings and belief systems that also can change our arousal levels. If we have a certain memory about somebody in red shoes that beat us up when we were kids, we tend to get very aroused when anybody wears red shoes around us, you know, kind of a thing. So these three different systems that operate our level of arousal here are well understood as being part of the brain activity down in the brain stem, the reticular activating system. Now, to kind of summarize all this real quickly here, I have drawn a schematic. You know, this isn't an anatomically correct picture, but what we're trying to represent here is, I'm getting the pointer ready here, is the brainstem down here, the thalamus, and the cortex up here, you know, the gray matter just under the skull here, the cerebral cortex up here. And we talked first about the basic rest activity cycle and how that is regulated. Now, we might call that the blue system. And the blue system is that kind of system that just regulates this 90-minute cycle ongoing all the time. There's another entire system which we'll just kind of nickname the red system. There's an entirely different neurological system that responds and changes our arousal level with sensory input. Okay, and there's an entirely independent system, which we would call the green system here. Okay, they're not really blue and green and red, you know. You couldn't open up a person's brain and find, where's that red system anyway? But I'm just kind of nicknaming them so that you understand there are three different systems here. This one has to do with, you know, the feelings and the emotions and the belief systems and how they affect our level of arousal. Now, it's a very complex issue because these things are always working together all of the time. And I don't want to get into the neurological depth of this too much, but I do want you to understand that there is a well-understood automatic neurological system that regulates our levels of arousal. It's a very well-understood kind of a system. Now, one of the things we could do, obviously, is to change that level of arousal, which would change our first-person experience with the world. But what about content? If there is, in fact, a neurological system that is responsible for the arousal level, you know, whether we're sleepy and restful or playing basketball beta, that's a well-understood brainstem neurological function that regulates that. What is it that regulates the contents then of our experience? Each one of us sitting in the room here is having a slightly different content of your experience in the room than the next one. You know, it kind of reminds me of a joke. We're talking about exploring altered states of consciousness, and remember reading an interesting little joke about I have 5 kids, so I really can relate to this. The 6-year-old girl, her first day at school, and her brothers and her sisters have told her all about this grand adventure she's going to be going on and all the new friends she's going to make, and she's just wide-eyed and filled with excitement, and lo and behold, she learns there's something called recess, and that's where you get to go out and play with all your friends, and it's really great. She gets out onto the playground and looks around at all these new people and walks up to the first kid she sees and says, you know, tell me, are you the opposite sex or am I? Well, obviously this reflects all the little talks that her brothers and sisters and their mom and dad had with her, right? So if we're talking about altered states of consciousness, then I have to look at each one of you and say, are you in an altered state or am I in an altered state? You know, you have to turn to your neighbor and say, I'm not in an altered state, you must be. Because each one of us is having a different first-person experience sitting here. Well, the point being is that without a reference point, you can't define what altered is. I mean, here is one state of consciousness, and here's another state of consciousness, and here's another state of consciousness, and one of them just isn't altered. So when we talk about exploring various ranges of states of consciousness, to be concerned about this concept of altering, because we're going to switch cognitive content here, or we're going to switch the level of arousal, changing your first-person experience, altering your consciousness, but then it obtains this homeostasis. Okay, this is fine, and then it goes, whoa, and it gets upset again and alters, but then it maintains its own homeostasis and tends to be reinforcing in that. Content. If we understand the neurological system of arousal, what is the system? What do we kind of know about content? Well, content seems to be regulated by, seems to be different in each one of us based on our social psychological conditioning and our mental acuity. As we grow up, whether you grow up in a single family or through siblings, how your parents relate to you, how other kids relate to you at school, how successful you are, those are all social psychological conditioning things and equip you for the experiences of life. It's kind of your worldliness. If you kept someone locked in a box all the time, they wouldn't have the ability to experience very much in their life. They just don't have a big repertoire on which they can balance their experiences. Mental ability can have to do with education and exposure to different things, and I don't necessarily mean collegiate education. What I'm talking about is simply a vast range of exposure to a number of different circumstances, but it can also mean some sort of neurological deficit. If you get hit over the head with a baseball bat, you might have a neurological deficit. You might need a new Pentium chip or something. So it can, in fact, mean having neurological deficits might limit your mental ability as well. So it isn't just an educational process. Now, getting back to the idea of altering one or the other, of changing one of the balance systems, either it be the arousal level or the cognitive content level, let's talk about hemisync and its ability to change the arousal level. When two sounds come together, they form something called a binaural beat. Now, this binaural beat then has the power to affect or change your level of arousal. Now, Mr. Monroe didn't himself discover binaural beats or invent binaural beats. Binaural beating, the experience of hearing binaural beating, and I'm going to give you an example of it in just a minute here. The experience of hearing binaural beating is an anatomical fact. This was discovered by H.W. Dove back in the 1800s, that we had this thing called binaural beating, and then it was explored further at the Maimonides Institute by Gerald Oster, and he gave us nice charts on what frequencies are best for binaural beating, what frequency ranges are done. And he did this through, normal laboratory audiology tests where when you hear the tone, you raise your hand, you don't hear it anymore, you put your hand down. So we have this nice profile of human hearing. In understanding why do we have this phenomena, it's believed to be kind of an anthropological inheritance. If you follow the belief system or the theory of evolution, survivalist evolution, then they have kind of an explanation of it. And I talk about the theory of survivalist evolution in that way because there are other theories. There's creation theory that God put us here all to say hi to each other. There's the idea that some of us are from planet Xenon and we're beamed down to be here. So if we look at the theory of evolution, then we can kind of catch why do our bodies have the ability to hear binaural beats now? And that might be something like this. Imagine going back several thousands of years and we hear a saber-toothed tiger growling in the jungle. Well, there's two guys standing there, and one says, oh my goodness, I hear the tiger in the jungle, I'm going to run this direction, okay? The other guy stands there and says, I hear something too, I wonder where that is. Well, the tiger jumps on him and eats him. The guy that ran away starts begatting, and the offspring then inherit those survival characteristics that made him smart enough to know which way to run. And we stand here and look back at him and call him our ancestor, but we have that characteristic because it worked well, it made him survive. Well, what it had to do was the sense of direction. Audiologists tell us now that when you're talking about low frequency sounds, down below about 1,000 cycles per second, that because of the diameter of our heads, the waveform comes and arrives at this ear, and then a microsecond later arrives over at the other ear. But our brain tells the difference between the two signals. It says, hey, there's a slight difference in phase between this signal and this signal. Now, as infants, we learn to adjust that by turning our heads and get rewarded by discovering the source of the noise. We hear something banging, and when we turn that direction, we find the banging. So it's a natural learning process to adjust the difference. It's not like, sitting on your dad's knee. He says, now, honey, notice the phase difference between your left ear and your right ear. If you will, that isn't the way it works. It's just kind of this natural learning process, left and right. So let's skip forward a few thousands of years then, and we'll invent stereo, and we'll invent earphones, and then we'll artificially recreate this phase difference between the left and the right again, just like having it come from over here comes to the right ear. But this time we're inside stereo headphones, and there's a phase difference. Well, no matter how much you turn your head, you're trapped in your headphones. It isn't going to go away. The phase difference is going to persist. So the brain has to tell executive consciousness, hey, there's a difference between my right ear and my left ear. And the way it does this is through the perceived phenomena of hearing the binaural beat. So you think you hear wah, 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 wah. And I say think you hear because it actually isn't in this earphone. It actually isn't in this earphone. It's the brain calculating the difference in the tones and pulsing neurotransmitters, pulsing these neurotransmitters at that rate. Now, I have an example of that here. This is going to be an interesting one-handed thing here. I'll lower that speaker first, push this button here. Anybody hear this? There's one speaker. Why don't we just put these together and use the microphone? Now, if I turn off that speaker, turn on the other speaker. Now I turn them both up together. That vibrato or vibration then is what occurs in the earphones and what your brain detects as binaural beating. Now, again, Bob Monroe didn't discover binaural beats or invent binaural beats, but in his quest to discover why it was he was having these unusual experiences, he remembered back to his early research in trying to develop sleep learning back in the late 50s. And he started using binaural beats to kind of keep people in stage 2 sleep, keep them sort of awake so they could do sleep learning experiments. And he was the subject of much of his own experimentation until one day he woke up looking down at his bed saying, "Who's that man in bed with my wife?" Well, it turned out to be him, and that he found out, so this is what happens when you stay awake and your body goes to sleep, you know. And that started a whole new world. He kind of forgot all about sleep learning and started investigating these unusual states of consciousness. Now let's talk a little bit more about what this thing called binaural beating means here. We're going to put these binaural beats into the reticular activating system and into the red system. Remember, there are 3 systems ongoing. We're going to insert the binaural beat into the red system. That then provides information to the reticular activating system that pumps the neurotransmitter acetylcholine up to the cortex and tells different areas of the brain to be aroused to a different level. In most cases, the hemisync tones actually quiet the arousal down, but it communicates information to them to quiet this arousal level down. We know that the reticular activating system, the extended reticular thalamic activating system, is functioning because there is evidence of the binaural beat in the brain. We can put an electrode, an EEG electrode on top of the head and see this very quiet wah, 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 wah signal on top of the brain called the frequency following response. But it's a very quiet signal, very much in the background. It does not represent your overall brainwave activity. It's only neurological evidence that the binaural beating is present within the neurological system. It is the effect that the reticular activating system has, because that's the thing that controls the arousal level. Now, a very simple binaural beat like the one you heard there has some sort of a limited potential for changing arousal levels, but a more complex binaural beat like we use at the Monroe Institute actually mimics a brainwave pattern and is accepted much more readily by the reticular activating system because it looks like a complex brainwave pattern and therefore has a great deal more power to alter arousal levels. Now, I want to review that this is a very complex system, okay? The binaural beating is only providing information to the red system, okay? But we have all this other going on too. So when you put a hemisync tape on or listen to binaural beats, are you guaranteed that it's going to move you to this arousal level? And the answer is no, because it's a competitive system. You have the blue system in there that is this 90-minute swing kind of a thing. And if you're rising to the peak of your 90-minute awaken alert, somebody's turning the volume up on the radio, awaken alert, and you put a sleep binaural beat in there, it's probably not going to be nearly as effective as if you were down in the bottom of the trough, because the blue system is competing with the red system in that kind of a case. On the green system, that has to do with belief systems and memories, past experience. If you have a fear issue that's brought up, it's going to keep pumping. We're staying awake. It's going to keep pumping that in there all the time. And so it's in competition with the gentle binaural beats on the red system. So keep in mind that this is a wonderful mechanism that helps us jump out of the way when the Murita bread truck comes around the corner. You know, the red system says, look, it's the Murita red truck. Wake up the motor nerve system. Everybody get ready to jump out of the way. Okay, jump out of the way. You know, it's a wonderful working mechanism. That's the way it works. But we have to remember it's always in competition with each other, trying to balance us at the appropriate kind of arousal level. Now, I have to pour myself some water here. Everybody take a break. Is there evidence that what I'm telling you is true? It sounds complex, sounds mixed up, but is there evidence that it's true? And the answer is yes. I'm about to show you that evidence. We don't just have to look at this as a theory. Because we have some understanding of the neurology and how we work, we know, in terms of neurological fact, that the thing that regulates the activity of the cortex, the arousal level of the cortex, is the balance of neurotransmitters produced by the reticular activating system. So if we give someone a binaural beat, we ought to be able to see evidence that it is affecting the cortex. So what we'll do is we'll put electrodes around the top of the cortex here like this, hook them up to a brain mapping scheme like this, and actually see the results of applying a binaural beat and how the reticular activating system then adjusts the brainwave arousal level. Now, from a more wider range here, binaural beats can affect a huge variety of brainwaves, different kinds of brainwave states, and certain combinations of brainwave states as well. From a scientific perspective, let's look at, the world of statistics and a formalized experiment here. When we produce a hemisync learning system, this is a 45-minute long tape, for example, and we have these very complex waveforms like I showed you before. Part of that waveform involves alpha. So this is at the beginning of our 45 minutes, there's a lot of alpha in the signal, and then it diminishes down. And there's some delta theta in there, and it goes up like this. So as the 45-minute tape is moving along, the stimulus that you get through the binaural beats is changing all the time. And if we look just at the alpha and the delta components, this is what it looks like. But the question is does the brain follow that? Does the brain respond to that stimulus? So what if we went along every now and then along this 45 minutes and measured the person's brain waves and says, okay, we'll take this slice here, and we'll take another slice, and we'll take another slice, and see if it actually follows that. So in a scientific experiment, you would record, and this is an actual person, you would record the brain waves at a baseline before they got any hemisync tones. You'd make a recording afterwards as well. And here we're looking at the alpha brain waves in the back of the head here. And you see that both before and after, you have elevated alpha brain waves. But down here, they seem to follow. When we take measurements periodically of the brain waves, they seem to follow this pattern of the stimulus itself. I have someone that's following the pattern of stimulus themselves right now. If I talk very slowly and you were up all night long. How about the delta side of the house? In this tape, in the stimulus that we gave, it has a decreasing alpha component and an increasing delta component. We've seen how the person's brain waves in the back of the head followed the alpha, how about up here on the top, how did they follow the delta here? And this is again, the delta curve like this going up. How did they follow the delta curve? And you see again here, this is before the tones and after the tones, and here's how their brain waves followed the progression of delta here as things went along. So this is objective evidence that the brain is, in fact, responding to the binaural beat signals. It isn't just this subjective reporting that people do. Oh, it was a wonderful experience. It was really great. And you think, well, did I make it all up, or what was going on here? We actually have objective evidence here without the subjective overlay. It's okay to have a wonderful experience, even if I do have objective evidence. So, how do we then apply this technology? How do we then utilize what we know about HemiSync in a learning kind of environment when you listen to these kind of binaural beats? Well, here at the center, the Nancy Penn Center, where people come for week-long programs, we offer a variety of ways to access these different states of consciousness. The first program that people come to at the Institute is called the Gateway. It's a 6-day program, and it's an introductory level course for those to kind of understand the Monroe technology, to understand kind of the philosophy of the way we do things. And for many people, the first time they open that window, open that gateway to exploring consciousness. So this is kind of our prerequisite program that we suggest everybody come to. Now, there are, in fact, local programs all over the world, and I literally mean all over the world. There's a Monroe Institute Center in Geneva, Switzerland, for example, and there are instructors all over the world. Francine King, who has a booth out here, teaches local weekend kinds of work called a Gateway Experience, but she also comes up to the Institute and is one of our trainers that comes to the Institute as well. So you might talk to Francine a little bit more about her local programs if you want to try this out for a weekend. And I want to stress that, remember I told you something that happened to me over 20 years ago? HemiSync works for me, but if you're interested in exploring consciousness, you have to find out if it works for you. That can be buying a $9.95 tape called The Way of HemiSync and listening to it, giving yourself a chance at least 3 times listening to it. And if it doesn't work for you, then return the tape and say, well, that isn't what I was looking for. Find what works for you. HemiSync is one way to explore consciousness, but there are many other ways. You have to find out for you if it works. The Guidelines program is different. The Guidelines program focuses on a deeper inner discovery of what you might call your total self, your personal guide, your guardian angel, dialoguing and becoming one with that side of yourself. Psychologists refer to it as the inner self-helper, that there's this like master personality in all of us that knows everything that's going on. And so, why do we have to be trapped in being a chauffeur, being a parent, being an office worker, all little sub-personalities that we have? We can actually become one with that master personality, the great inner self-helper. Become one with your own guidance, one with your own guardian angel. Find out who you really are. Now, the Lifeline program, the Lifeline program isn't for everybody. Lifeline program is about exploring those dimensions beyond what we know as physical death. And not everybody wants to do that. Not everybody is ready to explore those realms. You've heard of people who have near-death experiences, and that after their near-death experiences, their kind of perspective on life changes. They realize the precious value of life without fearing death. Well, this kind of impact that it has upon them and their family is the same thing you take away from Lifeline, because you actually explore these realms with your fellow companions, bringing back information that is validatable, and the depth of your experience is not just a coffee table discussion about, yeah, well, I don't know, I think I believe in life after death. Yeah, it could be so, maybe. This is a first-person experience of those realms that is very powerful, and so you walk away from it different person. Now, that in itself is kind of scary. Do I want to be different than I am right now? I mean, I think I'm okay right now. Why would I want to be different? And sometimes a spouse will say, I don't want you going away to that weird place. You're going to come back changed, kind of thing. It's sort of like saying, I don't want you to go on a rafting trip down the Colorado River because you're going to come back with lots of self-assurance and confidence in yourself, and I don't want that to be the case. Once you become skilled in exploring these realms after death, we offer the Exploration 27 program. Has anybody here gone to see the new Robin Williams movie, What Dreams May Come? Yeah. If you haven't, go do it. It's mandatory. There is nothing that I found technically wrong with that movie and what was portrayed. It's just a wonderful, beautiful movie about how the world works, how the universe works after death. Exploration 27 is about exploring those dimensions so that it is not a strange territory. Heartline is about dealing with some of the emotional issues that drive us in life. People say that 80% of who and what we are is subconscious, and 80% of what we do are driven by unconscious emotional structures and belief systems that come out of our childhood. I don't know if all that's true, but I do know that opening your heart and becoming all that you can be and taking responsibility, personal responsibility for the universe and for what's going on, not blaming others, not saying, oh, well, they did that to me, or, oh, things are really terrible and they're really bad, and say, well, who's creating that? That's you. And take personal responsibility. That's what Heartline's all about. Now, guess what? It's our least popular program. What, me responsible? Oh, I don't want to be responsible. So although we only run, 3 or 4 of those programs a year, whereas the others we run 20 or 30, a very special group of people wind up at Heartline. Now, let's talk a bit about the focus levels that were introduced on the tape there. The concept of moving to different focus levels. Now, in Monroe speak, in the language of Monroe, we talk about focus 10, focus 12, focus 15. Bob Monroe invented those names in an attempt to be sort of neutral. He didn't want to say focus pretty neat, focus wonderful, focus great. He didn't want to say the red zone and the green zone and the yellow zone. He wanted to think of some sort of neutral nonsense so that it wouldn't lay any front-loading on people about what to expect. In technical terms or in neurological terms, the focus levels mean levels of arousal. They don't mean content per se. They mean level of arousal. So when you move to focus 10, it is a level of arousal, and we have some characteristics of what that level of arousal is like. Focus 10 is just laying there or sitting in your chair and allowing all the sensory data to disappear, to fade into the background. And you think, well, gee, I don't hear anything, don't see anything, don't feel anything, don't taste anything, but I'm still here. Even without all these orienting physical things that regular psychologists would say in terms of sensory integration. The theory of sensory integration is that we know who and what we are by the input of our five senses. Well, what if we flip the switch and turn off the five senses? In one sense, in one concept, you would be nothing. You would be gone. And yet we can, in fact, isolate you from your five senses, and you're still there, and you're thinking, oh, wait, I'm still here. Now what do I do? So focus 10 is that first kind of awareness, or that first kind of level of arousal where your five senses aren't present. Then you move on to focus 12, and you learn that there are other ways of knowing things, other ways of collecting information that aren't necessarily related to your five senses. And yet we are semantically crippled to express what we know and find out in terms of our five senses. I heard this, I saw this, I smelled this, and yet these things we're finding out beyond our sense organs, but we are semantically crippled to describe them to one another in terms of our sense organs. So, find out that you exist beyond your senses in focus 10. Find out that there are other ways of knowing beyond your five physical senses in focus 12. And then find out that that knowing, that way of collecting information, doesn't have any limitations in space or time. Information about the senses, things that we get with our five senses, is in fact limited to space and time. And my voice has to go to this microphone in a particular space-time continuum for it to be amplified, but not in focus 15, because time and space aren't relative to the information available there. So that is a focus level, a level of arousal. The content of the information we haven't talked about yet. Just the level of arousal that is characteristic of this kind of perception. If focus 15 is beyond space and time, focus 21 is beyond who and what. The suspension of the personal ego, the collective consciousness, the definition of what in terms of the physical world. So if 15 is beyond space and time, which is kind of, we can stretch that out and say, okay, beyond space and time, then focus 21 is beyond the concepts of who or what. So you might have a focus 21 experience, and somebody say, well, who was it? And it's like, somehow that question doesn't make any sense. You know, we're on, well, what was it that happened? Well, the what is a little bit not the right sense of word here to use in this kind of a dimension. Excuse me. So where are we then? We have a technique, a technical means of altering our level of arousal. But that doesn't necessarily mean we have, at this stage, a technical means of inviting you into a particular experience. You know, so far I've said, listen, HemiSync can take you to Disneyland, but it can't make you have fun, you know. It's kind of like, once you do what you experience when you're in Focus 10, Focus 12, is still up to you. We can't make you have a good experience. We can only put you at that focus level. And yet, in the programs that we have, we're respectful of this, and we're going to try to address that issue. So what can we do in terms of content of your experience? You get into this nice meditative state. You know, what can we do to encourage a different first-person experience, a spiritual awakening, a remote viewing, an out-of-body experience? What can we do to encourage that, given a level of arousal. If we can set the volume control, what can we do to change the channel, to change the content, so that you can have a first-person experience? Well, we must be able to do something with this thing called social psychological conditioning, or something with this mental ability. If we're going to put our fingers on the scale, so to speak, and alter this part of the equation, we're going to have to deal with this realm. So this is how we do it. While you're there for the week, all of these tools are being applied in the group dynamic with the two psychotherapists there that are trainers that help you through that process. Now, guess what? I'm telling you the magic formula here, but it still works. You know, even if you tell someone the magic, it still works. Okay? I remember working with my kids and they wanted to learn to do card tricks, and I'd say, okay, well, here's this card trick. Now, from this point forward, don't believe what I'm going to tell you. Okay? Don't believe anything I say. I'd say this to my kids. And they'd say, okay, Daddy. And I'd say, are you ready? And I'd say, okay, Daddy. I'd say, look, I take this card and I put it here, and I take this card and I put it here. Look, they're all together. And they say, how did you do that, Daddy? And I said, did you believe me when I told you that I was putting it here? Yes. Didn't I tell you not to believe me? So I can tell you the magic, and it doesn't stop it from happening, right? I mean, when you go to the Institute, there's purposely group interaction, guided visual imagery exercises, affirmations given, all of which have to do with a very powerful element of changing your social psychological conditioning, plus the fact that you've left your job, gone away on a one-week vacation that you probably won't tell your neighbors where you went, joined in with 20 other weirdos on this wonderful adventure. So there's all this social psychological setup to help you. And it's different than if you just sit at home on your couch one night and said, I think I'm going to try that out-of-body stuff, and, you know, lay back on your couch and say, well, it didn't happen to me. I don't know what's going on here. You know, the intensity of getting together in a group environment is very powerful stuff. How about education side of the house? How about what's happening right now? Okay, isn't what I'm doing right now part of this? So that 2 months from now, when you come to the Institute to go to a program, or you visit Francine and do one of her weekend sessions, don't you think what I have said to you today impacts upon your ability to have an experience? I'm messing with the educational system right now in what I'm doing, what I'm saying, what I'm talking about. So in summary, the Monroe Institute is interested in exploring focused states of consciousness and wants to allow others to explore focused states of consciousness. And we do this with a multidisciplined approach, not only using the hemisync sound patterns that, you know, are patented and trademarked, but putting them in a milieu of education and social psychological conditioning environment to allow you to have expanded first-person experiences with reality. We think of it as research. Interestingly enough, you know, the father of modern psychology, Erickson, talked about defining research as the exploration of reality through personal experience. And we think that's what the Institute is all about. All we offer you is a tool for you to personally experience these realms yourself, to explore and find out yourself about these realms. Okay, we have some time for questions. Have some time to go potty if you have to, too. Hi.
Hi. It sounds like to me all of what you said depends on neural impulses through the auditory nerve. Have you ever encountered a situation where someone couldn't hear in one of their ears? Does that just leave them out in the cold?
Sure. No. Yes, and yes, we have had situations with people that are either totally deaf or have reduced hearing in one ear. Now, in the case of reduced hearing, you can still hear a binaural beat because the volume levels don't matter so much in binaural beating. That's one of the uniquenesses over binaural beating. The way to find out is to buy that tape the way of Hemisync, or as a matter of fact, don't even bother with that. You can download it off our website here. You can listen right on our website to this. You don't have to buy a tape. And if you hear wah, 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 then your brain is getting the binaural beat. Now, if you have total auditory loss in your ear, then what you can do is go to mixing those tones together electrically, or put them over speakers like I have done here, and then they'll mix in the air, and you'll still get the beating thing. Remember, the concept of binaural beats is something unique to the 20th century and the invention of headphones.
What about bone transmission?
Bone transmission is an interesting thing. People have been experimenting with the neurophone as a way of doing the same thing. Haven't got any conclusions yet. There's 3 people that I know of that are experimenting, and they send me an email every now and then telling me how they're doing it. I think that if we were to construct a special tape, that using the neurophone might work well, but using the neurophone with some of our existing shelf tapes doesn't seem to work. There's no reason why bone conduction wouldn't work as well. Anything that gets into the reticular activating system is what we're after. And it doesn't have to be the technology of binaural beating. I mean, tribal communities have been beating drums and humming and everything for thousands of years. So getting to the reticular activating system through the sense organs is what's important.
So it sounds like by adjusting the volumes and the
sure. Mix them
headphones.
together electrically. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Chip. Who is or was David Francis?
Who's David Francis?
Yes.
Nobody has ever asked that question before. David Francis was a very personal friend of Bob Monroe's for a number of years, was a coal miner in West Virginia, and loaned Bob a lot of money to get started and so forth, and then upon his death, willed the money to Bob. So when you're in big business, apparently what you do to give other people money is you loan it to them at no interest rates, and then he doesn't have to pay taxes on it and all that other stuff. And so then when he died, they wrote off the loan, and they named the building after him.
Thank you.
I sense a tremendous struggle out there amongst various organizations to control my mind, to control what I'm thinking, all the way from the government, possibly with the HARP system, various fundamentalist religious groups, all the way from, including the Scientologists, I won't name it, all the way from one spectrum to the other. The Maharishi University of Plainview, Iowa, seems to have an interesting program I know very little about. They all want to get a hold of my mind. Not to say anything about the 2 political parties that want to get me to vote one way or the other in a few days here.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, commercial television and, buy Gleam toothpaste is definitely a mind control game. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Do you want to say a word about this? Yeah, who's trying to, the struggle to control, we have the Cult Awareness Network trying to fight I don't know what, and to me it's a tremendous pressure to get me to think one way or another.
Yes, I agree. That's all around us. Being, what we might call propaganda or political issues, or whether we're going to buy Gleam toothpaste or buy a, particular record album, there is an attempt to capture the attention of our minds. Some people have looked at what the Monroe Institute says and says, well, is that mind control? And, God, that's a huge discussion. Our minds are not our bodies. Our minds are beyond our bodies. And we, in our teaching processes, are all about self-empowerment. If there's only one thing that we suggest, we don't teach any doctrine, any particular belief system, or that you have to eat alfalfa on Tuesday or anything else. What we just say is, since you come here to the Monroe Institute, you might want to consider that you're more than your physical body. End of statement. But you've got to go find out what that means for yourself. if you don't think that's right for you, that doesn't make sense to you, then you're not at the right place. But any other kind of dogma is just not something we do. People will come to our trainers and say, well, I just had this experience where I was out here and I did this and I did that, and what do you think that means, Francine? And Francine every time will say, well, what does that mean to you? You know, so I agree. Be on guard. Every time you're presented with something in the, in the grocery store, they arrange things on shelves and on different colors because they know you pick up red more than you pick up green, kind of things. Yes, they are after our minds. Actually, after our wallets. Through our minds. Exactly.
In the early days, Monroe wrote a book about astral projection. He seemed to explore that term.
Yes.
You've pretty much avoided any mention of astral projection. Is the Monroe Institute using this technique, or is it just semantics?
The concept of astral projection or the out-of-body experience, obviously Bob focused on that in the 3 books that he wrote. But he himself respected that was only one domain, one way to explore. And I used to talk to him in his later years about this, and he said, the idea of a body is kind of a habit anyway. So people think, gee, when I get out of my body, will I still have all my anatomy? And it's like, sure you will, if you want it. After a while it becomes, well, it's just kind of only a convenient habit. You can have it if you want it. We, in our literature, specifically say, listen, we don't guarantee you an out-of-body experience because a number of people will come and they'll sign up, I want the out-of-body experience tape. And it's like, what have we been talking about here? We can only offer you focus levels. The experience that you have is up to you. We can take you to Disneyland, but we can't make you have an out-of-body experience. We can't make you have fun at Disneyland. You might decide to just sit there and people watch. You might decide to get on the Dumbo ride and go on that. You might decide to go to one of the many restaurants in Disney World, but we can't make you have fun. So we can't make you have an out-of-body experience. And the Monroe Institute isn't the only way of dealing with the issue of out-of-body experiences. I mean, have a heart attack. I didn't mean that seriously, but, go to sleep, right? We feel that the thing at night called delta sleep, that unconscious time that you don't remember, is when you're out of your body. Bob Monroe seriously felt that there's no such thing as being unconscious. You're just conscious somewhere else. Yes, next question.
I've done some reading about frequency, and recently I was reading about ELF, or extra low frequency, and how that has the ability to change our mind or our brain waves and make it more accessible to impression. Do you know, since you deal with frequency and what it does to states of consciousness, are you aware in your line of work or come across this information that could be true?
Certainly, if you start messing around in the frequencies below about 50 cycles per second, it has the ability to alter our brain's processes. I didn't get into it in the lecture, but the actual cellular process has to do with potassium, sodium ions on the surface of the cell that change their orbit and become more permeable, allowing the flow of acetylcholine and other neurotransmitters. Now, just because we do it with binaural beats, natives did it with drums and chanting and blowing flutes and whistles. Is some evil force doing it with microwaves? Well, if they play in the realms below 50 hertz, it's certainly a possibility. Now, there's a lot of science about whether or not our general way of living in the electric environment we live in can affect us in some way. And I would say go to the journal Bioelectromagnetics. The journal Bioelectromagnetics seems to be the most popular and well-balanced academic journal on these kinds of studies.
I'm
I'd like to know how you explain the fact that,
Very carefully.
yeah, I hope so, that our bodies basically are providing a chemical combination, a reaction physiologically to have this happen. We are then leaving our body, okay, and taking feelings with us. Because I've done this since 1967, okay? Sure. And I know that I have feelings, and I experience feeling when I'm out of body. Mm-hmm. I don't understand, though, how I physiologically cause that to happen. Mm-hmm. All the electrobio things that happen to me in my body cause it to happen and cause my feelings. But yet, when I'm out of my body, I still have them.
Yeah. Your question is beyond the scope of this presentation.
I was afraid of that.
I present this presentation to you to describe in kind of straight-laced, let's publish this in neurological journals kind of data, which explains to the neurologists of today how this works or how this might work. Obviously, we are not our bodies, okay?
Obviously.
Perhaps what we think we experience in our body is some sort of a downgraded reflection of the true experience in our spiritual forms. We are inequipped. You know, I don't have little meters and microscopes that will look at the other world, and so we deal with what we got. Bob always used to say, I was measuring the smoke and not the fire, you know, kind of a thing. I mean, you say, but what else you got? You know, it's like the stock market, you know, future results don't depend on past performance. But what else do you got? You know, you don't know. We are not our bodies. We are not our brains. That's just meat. We are obviously something else. Have any of you heard the Pam Reynolds story in Michael Sabom's new book? The Pam Reynolds story is, I have 3 minutes to tell you the Pam Reynolds story. The Pam Reynolds story is the first medically documented proof of a very interesting thing. A lot of these near-death experiences that people have where they fly around and visit other people and so forth and so on, see themselves going through a tunnel. The medical doctors will come back and say, oh, well, that's just collapse of the neurons and tunnel vision that caused that. That sounds kind of convenient as an explanation to me, you know. What if years ago they hadn't named that experience tunnel vision? They named it whoop-de-doo vision. And then we'd come along with a near-death experiencer and saying, well, I perceive myself going through this tunnel. Well, then this other community wouldn't have this convenient word called tunnel vision to lay on this. They'd say, doesn't sound like whoop-de-doo vision to me, you know, kind of thing. It's just a semantic convenience. In the case of Pam Reynolds, there's a book coming out by Michael Sabom, so write down his name, Michael Sabom. The book title has the word light in it. It had an October publication date, so you need to ask your bookstore to look up books by Michael Sabom. He has others, and get the one with the word light in the title that was published this month. In it, there's a chapter on Pam Reynolds. The Pam Reynolds story is very unique. This woman had an aneurysm on the back of her brain that was inoperable. Inoperable because if they went in there and punctured the aneurysm, she'd be dead just like that, no doubt about it. So they elected to do something like cryogenic surgery. They wanted to cool her body off until all her body functions stopped and then do the surgery. So what they did was to go into her femoral artery and vein and put her on a heart-lung machine, cooled her down below 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and all her body processes stopped except that she was on a heart-lung machine. Then they tilted her body up like this and drained all the blood out of her cranium. There was no blood, no oxygen uptake, no EEG, and no evoked potential responses. The brain gone out of there. Okay? Opened her up, operated on the aneurysm, glued her together with super glue, laid her back down, reinvigorated her, warmed her up, and she recovered completely. having had a very interesting out-of-body experience during the time when there was no brain activity, describing conversations that went on in the room, describing the medical equipment that was used on her. So what is the explanation for this? In the book, Michael Sabom is challenging what we define as death. You know, first it was not breathing, then it was heart not beating, and then it was no brain activity. And all those things happened in her case. And yet she still had this experience. So what's happening? How could this be? Hey, we are more than our physical bodies. That's how. Thank you very much.